My son skipped his mother's funeral, calling it not worth his time. While I was burying my wife, he was basking on the beaches of Florida. A week later, he called, pleading, "Dad, the mortgage hasn't been paid." My response was cold. "I don't care anymore." He was shocked, but that was only the beginning. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. My hands trembled as I pressed Timothy's contact for the fourth time in 30 minutes. The funeral director's sympathetic glance made my stomach clench, but I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on Margaret's casket. Polished oak gleamed under the gray morning light, white lilies cascading over brass handles that caught every flicker of sun breaking through heavy clouds. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Around me, relatives arrived in black cars, their hushed voices mixing with the distant hum of the groundskeeping crew. Aunt Mamie clutched a tissue, her eyes already red. Cousin Robert straightened his tie, checking his watch. Everyone seemed to know their place, their role in this final goodbye. Everyone except my son. 4 rings, 5, 6. "Dad?" Timothy's voice finally cut through, but something felt wrong. Background noise filtered through. Laughter, music, voices that didn't belong to a business meeting. "Timothy, son, where are you? The ceremony starts in 30 minutes. A pause. More of that strange background noise. Was that waves? "Dad, I can't make it. I have important business to handle." The words hit me like cold water. I gripped the edge of Margaret's casket, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palm. She would have known what to say. She always knew how to reach him when I couldn't. What business could be more important than your mother's funeral? Another pause. Longer this time. When Timothy spoke again, his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Dismissive, almost bored. "Honestly, this whole thing isn't worth my time. Stop bothering me." The phone felt heavy in my hand. Around me the world continued its gentle motion, guests finding seats, the pastor arranging his notes, maintenance workers clearing distant pathways, but I stood frozen, caught between the woman I'd loved for 37 years and the son who was rejecting us both. "Timothy, your mother, she's—" The dial tone cut through my stammering like a blade. I stared at the phone's black screen, my reflection distorted in its surface. Worth his time? Margaret had driven 6 hours through a snowstorm when Timothy had pneumonia in college. She'd missed her own sister's birthday party to attend his marketing presentations. She'd defended him to her friends when he'd been too busy to visit for 3 Christmases running. The first drops of rain touched my cheek, mixing with something warmer. "Mr. Cole?" The funeral director approached, his voice gentle but professional. "We should begin seating the family shortly." I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and turned toward the approaching relatives. Somehow I managed to shake hands with arriving family members, accepting their condolences with automatic responses. "Thank you for coming." She would have appreciated this. Yes, she fought bravely. But my mind remained stuck on Timothy's voice, on that casual dismissal of everything Margaret had meant to him. To us? Aunt Mamie squeezed my arm. "Where's Timothy? I haven't seen him yet." "He'll be along," I heard myself say, the lie tasting bitter. "Important business." The words felt like betrayal, even as I spoke them. Margaret deserved truth, even now, especially now. But standing beside her casket, surrounded by people who'd traveled hours to honor her memory, I couldn't bring myself to explain that our only child had chosen something else over this final goodbye. Thunder rumbled overhead as I guided Mamie toward the front row of folding chairs. The ceremony would begin with or without Timothy. Margaret's life would be celebrated, her memory honored, her passing marked with the dignity she'd earned through decades of teaching, loving, giving. But as I took my seat in the front row, adjusting my black tie one final time, I couldn't shake the echo of my son's voice. "This whole thing isn't worth my time." The pastor approached the podium, his Bible open to a page marked with ribbon. Behind him, Margaret's photograph smiled from its easel, surrounded by those white lilies she'd always favored. In the picture, her eyes held the same warmth they'd shown on our wedding day, the same hope they'd carried when Timothy took his first steps, the same love they'd offered during every difficult moment our family had weathered. Rain began falling in earnest now, pattering against the canvas canopy stretched overhead. Somehow I managed to shake hands with arriving family members and take my seat in the front row. The pastor's voice carried across the gathering, warm and reverent, painting word pictures of Margaret's life that should have filled my heart with gratitude. Should have, but didn't. Margaret was a devoted mother who always put family first, he said, gesturing toward her photograph. She believed in the power of love to heal any wound. My phone buzzed against my chest. I tried to ignore it, forcing my attention back to the pastor's words, but my mind kept drifting to Timothy's voice, to that dismissive tone that still rang in my ears. Another buzz, then another. Around me, 40-some guests sat in respectful silence. Cousin Robert dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief. Mamie's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. They were here, present, honoring Margaret's memory while her own son was... The phone buzzed again. I glanced around, checking if anyone noticed my distraction, then carefully withdrew the device from my jacket pocket. The screen showed 3 notifications from Instagram, something about Timothy's wife, Sarah. I'd never paid much attention to social media, but Margaret had insisted I follow Sarah's account to see photos of their travels. She gave freely of her time, the pastor continued, teaching children not just academic subjects, but life lessons about kindness and integrity. The irony wasn't lost on me. I tapped the first notification. The screen filled with bright blues and greens, a stark contrast to the gray ceremony surrounding me. A video played automatically, showing crystal clear water lapping against white sand. Palm trees swayed in the background, and the audio picked up distant reggae music mixed with laughter. Then Sarah's voice, "What a perfect day in Miami. The weather is incredible." Miami. The camera panned across a resort pool where people lounged in swimwear, drinks in hand, poolside cabanas, beach volleyball in the distance. Pure vacation paradise, posted 15 minutes ago with a location tag that confirmed what I already knew. Miami Beach, Florida. My grip tightened on the phone. So that's what Timothy meant by important business. While we gathered to bury his mother, while relatives traveled from 3 states to pay respects, while I sat here trying to hold together the remnants of our family, he was sipping drinks on a beach. Margaret's greatest joy, the pastor said, came from watching her family grow and thrive. The video continued playing. Sarah's hand appeared in frame, holding a tropical drink garnished with fruit and tiny umbrellas. Behind her, resort guests played in the surf, their carefree laughter a universe away from our somber gathering. I wanted to throw the phone, wanted to scream, wanted to disrupt this peaceful ceremony with the raw truth of what kind of son Margaret had raised, despite all her love and sacrifice. Instead, I slipped the device back into my pocket and forced my face into an expression of appropriate grief. Let the pastor finish his tribute. Let Margaret's friends and family remember her as she deserved to be remembered. There would be time later to process what Timothy had done, what he was still doing while we honored the woman who'd given him life. But my hands shook with suppressed rage, and my leg bounced involuntarily against the metal chair. Every word of praise for Margaret's devotion to family felt like a knife twisting deeper. She'd believed in the power of love to heal wounds, but some wounds ran too deep for healing. The pastor closed his Bible and stepped aside for the next speaker, Margaret's former principal, who'd known her for 20 years. As she approached the podium, adjusting her glasses and shuffling her notes, I caught the eye of the funeral director standing near the back. He nodded sympathetically, probably assuming my obvious distress stemmed from normal grief. If only it were that simple. Rain continued drumming against the canopy overhead, but in Florida, the sun was shining. The weather was incredible, perfect for vacation while your mother's body waited to be lowered into cold ground. I whispered an excuse about needing air to Mamie, who squeezed my hand understandingly and walked steadily toward the maintenance area behind the cemetery shed. My rage built with each step, fueled by the contrast between Sarah's cheerful video and the reality of this gray morning. 37 years Margaret had loved that boy. 37 years of midnight fevers, school plays, graduation ceremonies, job interviews she'd practiced with him, relationship advice he'd never taken. She'd defended him to friends who wondered why he never visited, made excuses for missed holidays, sent care packages to his expensive Manhattan apartment, and this was how he honored her memory. Behind the maintenance shed, away from the ceremony's gentle murmur, I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. Not nervousness this time, pure, undiluted rage. The kind of anger I hadn't felt since Timothy was 17 and wrecked the car while joyriding with friends who'd pressured him into it. But even then, Margaret had been there to help me cool down, to find the right words. Now I was alone with my fury. I dialed his number without hesitation, my finger jabbing at the screen with more force than necessary. 1 ring, 2. He probably wouldn't answer, probably enjoying some poolside service or... "What now, Dad?" His voice carried that same annoyed edge, but this time I was ready for it. "Timothy, I just saw your wife's video from Miami Beach." Silence, just the sound of wind through my phone and distant vacation noise through his. "That's not what you think it is, Dad. Sarah's just..." "Don't lie to me," my voice echoed off the concrete shed, the first time I'd shouted in years. "You're on a beach while we're burying your mother." Another pause. When he spoke again, the pretense was gone. "Fine. Yes, I'm in Florida." "So what? This funeral is a waste of my time." The words hit harder than his earlier dismissal, because now I had proof of his callousness. While relatives sat in folding chairs listening to tributes, while flowers wilted in the rain, while Margaret's body lay waiting for her final rest. Her son was living his best life under palm trees. "A waste of time?" I paced behind the shed, kicking at loose gravel. "She gave birth to you. She loved you when no one else would. She defended you to everyone who criticized. She's dead, Dad." Timothy's voice cut through my anger like ice. "Standing around crying won't change that. I've got a life to live." The casual cruelty of it stopped me mid-pace. A life to live. As if Margaret's death was merely an inconvenience interrupting his vacation schedule. Rain pelted my face, mixing with tears I hadn't realized were falling. In the distance I could hear the principal's voice carrying across the cemetery, sharing stories of Margaret's dedication to her students. Stories Timothy would never hear because beaches were more important than mothers. "You're not my son anymore." The words left my mouth before I could stop them, final as a gavel strike. "Good," Timothy replied without missing a beat. "Don't call me again." The line went dead. I stared at the phone screen showing call ended and immediately hit redial. The phone rang once, then cut to voicemail. I tried again. This time, "The number you are calling is not available." Third attempt. "This caller has been blocked." He'd blocked me. While Margaret lay in her casket 50 yards away, while family and friends gathered to honor her memory, while rain soaked through my funeral suit, my son had blocked my number to ensure his vacation continued, uninterrupted. I tried twice more. Each attempt met with the same automated rejection. The technology he'd used to show me his beach paradise now served as a wall between us, deliberate and impenetrable. Thunder rolled overhead, and the rain intensified. Behind me I could hear the ceremony continuing. Probably Thurman sharing stories from our double dates 40 years ago, back when Margaret wore yellow sundresses, and Timothy existed only in our dreams of someday having children. My phone felt heavy in my hand, its screen reflecting my face, distorted by rain and rage. Blocked, cut off, dismissed as thoroughly as Margaret's memory had been dismissed. The maintenance shed offered no shelter from the storm, but I remained there anyway, letting the water soak through my jacket and run down my face. In Florida, the sun was still shining. The weather was still incredible. Sarah was probably posting another video by now, capturing their perfect day while we endured our imperfect grief. Slowly, I walked back toward the ceremony, my feet squelching in grass turned muddy by the downpour. Through the rain, I could see the gathered mourners still seated under their protective canopy, still listening to speakers who'd loved Margaret enough to brave this weather for her sake. Timothy's empty chair in the front row seemed to mock their loyalty. Margaret had always insisted on keeping it available, just in case he surprised us by showing up. "Hope," she'd called it. Sometimes hope is all we have. But hope, I was learning, could be a cruel companion. It had kept me dialing his number this morning despite knowing he wouldn't care. It had made me save his contact as Timothy's son in my phone, as if the label could preserve a relationship that had already died. As I approached the edge of the gathering, Mamie caught my eye and gestured to the empty seat beside her. The ceremony was nearing its end. I could tell by the way people were shifting in their chairs, reaching for tissues, preparing themselves for the final goodbye. I took my place among Margaret's true family, the people who'd chosen to be here despite rain and grief, and the simple human difficulty of watching someone you love disappear forever. They deserved better than my distraction. Margaret deserved better than a son who valued beach time over her memory. The pastor returned to the podium for closing remarks, but I barely heard his words. My mind remained stuck on that automated message. This caller has been blocked. Some wounds, I was learning, were too deep for Margaret's beloved power of love to heal. I walked the 100 yards back to the ceremony, each step heavier than the last, forcing my face into a mask of appropriate grief. The pastor's voice carried across the gathering as I slipped quietly back into my seat beside Mamie, who squeezed my hand without looking away from the podium. Margaret devoted her life to nurturing young minds, the pastor said, his voice warm with genuine affection. She believed every child deserved patience, understanding, and unconditional support. Mamie leaned close, whispering, Margaret was so proud of Timothy. Remember how she'd show everyone his marketing awards? Those fancy certificates from New York? My throat tightened. She always saw the best in him. He must be devastated to miss this. Traffic from New York can be terrible. I stared at Margaret's casket, those white lilies trembling slightly in the breeze. He had obligations he couldn't avoid? The lie tasted bitter, but what else could I say? That her beloved nephew had chosen poolside drinks over her farewell? That he'd dismissed 37 years of motherhood as not worth his time? When Timothy was 8, Mamie continued, oblivious to my internal struggle, Margaret spent 3 weeks helping him with that science fair project. Remember? The volcano that actually erupted in the kitchen? The memory hit like a physical blow. Timothy's excited face, flour and baking soda coating the counters, Margaret laughing as she cleaned up the mess. Daddy, when will Mama get better? I made her a drawing, 8-year-old Timothy had asked during her brief bout with bronchitis that year. Such simple love, then. Such pure concern for his mother's well-being. She never missed one of his school presentations, Mamie whispered. Even when she had the flu, she'd drag herself there. More memories flooded back, unbidden. Margaret driving through that snowstorm to reach his college when he had pneumonia. Missing her own sister's birthday party to attend his marketing presentations. Defending him to friends who wondered why he never visited. 2 years ago, when the doctor delivered Margaret's diagnosis, her first words had been about Timothy. How do we tell him? She'd whispered, gripping my hand in that sterile office, as if the cancer was something we'd done wrong, something that would disappoint our son. I'd called that night, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Son, your mother's having some health issues. Could you visit this weekend? Dad, it's really busy at work. You know how it is. Tell Mom I'm thinking of her. She'd rather hear it from you. I'll try to call later. He never did. The pattern continued for months. Brief phone calls where Timothy's attention clearly wandered. Visits that became monthly, then rare, then non-existent. Excuses about important meetings, crucial deadlines, career opportunities that couldn't wait. Margaret made excuses for him every time. He's just scared, Otis. Death frightens young people. Even as she grew thinner, weaker, more dependent on my help for simple tasks, she defended his absence. Maybe Timothy could come for Thanksgiving? She'd asked last November, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll ask him, I'd promised, knowing already what his answer would be. He's building his life, she'd said more to herself than to me. That's what children do. They build their own lives. But sitting here now, surrounded by 40 people who'd made time for her farewell, I understood what she'd refused to acknowledge. Timothy hadn't been building a life. He'd been abandoning the one that included us. Promise me you'll understand him, Margaret had whispered during those final weeks. He loves us in his own way. Her own way, as if love could be measured in excuses and empty promises. The pastor concluded his remarks, and the gathered mourners rose for final prayers. I stood automatically, my body following rituals, while my mind remained trapped in those painful months of watching Margaret fade while waiting for a son who never came. Around me, Voices joined in familiar words of comfort and farewell, but all I could hear was Timothy's voice from 2 hours ago. "This whole thing isn't worth my time." Mamie dabbed her eyes with a fresh tissue. She was blessed to have such a devoted family, she murmured. Devoted. The word echoed in my skull as the pastor closed his Bible and people began gathering their belongings. Margaret had been devoted, certainly. Devoted to a son who'd blocked his father's number to avoid inconvenience. Devoted to a child who'd grown into a man incapable of devotion in return. The ceremony was ending, and I still hadn't figured out how to explain Timothy's absence to the dozen relatives who'd ask. How to honor Margaret's memory while acknowledging the truth about the son she'd died, hoping to see one more time. The pastor's words faded as I was pulled back to that October morning 2 years ago when everything changed. Dr. Martinez had arranged the consultation files on her desk with practiced efficiency, but her expression held something I'd never seen before, the careful neutrality doctors adopt when delivering devastating news. "The cancer has spread more than we initially thought," she'd said, her voice professionally gentle. "We're looking at months, not years." Margaret's hand found mine across the small space between our chairs. How do we tell Timothy? Even then, facing her own mortality, her first concern was protecting our son from difficult truth. I'd called him that evening, my voice steady despite everything. "Son, your mother's having some health issues. The doctors want to start treatment right away." "What kind of treatment?" Timothy had asked, and for a moment I'd heard genuine concern in his voice. "Chemotherapy. It'll be tough, but she's strong." "Well, keep me posted. I'm sure she'll beat it." Posted. As if his mother's life was a social media update. The first few months hadn't been terrible. Timothy visited twice, bringing expensive flowers and staying for dinner. He'd seemed genuinely concerned, asking questions about treatment schedules, side effects, prognosis. Margaret had bloomed under his attention, chatting about his work, his apartment, his ambitious plans for advancement. But as the treatments progressed and Margaret's energy waned, his visits became monthly obligations rather than acts of love. He'd arrive with the same expensive flowers, stay for precisely 2 hours, then cite important meetings or early flights as reasons to leave. "He's just building his career," Margaret would say after each abbreviated visit. "Young people need to focus on their futures." By month 6, the visits stopped entirely. Phone calls became brief exchanges of essential information. "How's Mom doing?" "She's fighting." "Good. Tell her I love her." Click. I'd spent those months learning to be both husband and caregiver, learning to cook soft foods Margaret could keep down, learning to organize pill schedules, manage insurance claims, drive to endless medical appointments while taking notes on treatments I barely understood. The hospital visits were the worst. Sitting beside Margaret's chair during chemotherapy sessions, watching poison drip into her veins while she tried to remain cheerful for my sake. Other patients had visitors, children, friends, extended family taking turns providing support. We had each other, and that felt like everything until I realized it wasn't enough. "Could Timothy visit this weekend?" Margaret had asked one gray December afternoon, her headscarf slipping as she tried to sit up straighter. "I'm having a good day. I'd like him to see me looking better." I dialed his number with hands that shook more from anger than anxiety. "Dad, it's really crazy here. This client demands revisions by Monday, and I'm already behind schedule." "Your mother specifically asked for you. She's feeling stronger today." "That's great news. Tell her I'll definitely come soon. Maybe next month when things calm down." Things never calmed down. Timothy's excuses became more elaborate, more professional sounding, more final. Important presentations. Crucial deadlines. Career opportunities that couldn't wait for family obligations. Margaret stopped asking directly, but I'd catch her checking her phone when it buzzed, hoping for calls that never came. She'd brighten when I mentioned Timothy's name, then carefully avoid asking when he might visit. The final months were a blur of increasing helplessness. Margaret needed help with basic tasks. Showering, dressing, eating meals I'd learned to prepare for someone whose appetite had disappeared. I'd moved her bed to the living room so she could see the garden she'd loved, watch birds at the feeder we'd hung outside the window. "Maybe Timothy could come for Thanksgiving?" she'd whispered one November evening, her voice barely audible above the humming of the oxygen concentrator. I'd called him again, this time abandoning subtlety. Son, your mother is dying. She wants to see you. How long does she have? The doctors think weeks, maybe a month. I'll try to arrange something. Work is just insane right now, but family comes first. Family comes first. The lie was so casual, so automatic, I wondered if he even heard himself say it. Thanksgiving came and went. Margaret had been too weak to eat, but she'd insisted I put on football games because Timothy always enjoyed watching with us. She'd dozed fitfully, waking periodically to ask if he'd called. He hadn't. December brought final decline. Margaret slept most days, waking only for medications and brief conversations that felt like borrowed time. She'd still ask about Timothy, but indirectly now. Is he working hard? Does he sound happy? Tell him his mother loves him. I'd stopped calling by then. What was the point? Timothy had made his choice months ago. Promise me you'll understand him, Margaret had whispered during what turned out to be our last real conversation. Death frightens young people. He'll regret this some day. Regret, as if Timothy's absence was mere fear rather than calculated selfishness. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in January, her hand still warm in mine as dawn broke through our bedroom window. I'd held her while she drew her final breath, whispering reassurances about Timothy's love that we both knew weren't true. The first call I'd made was to Timothy. Dad, is everything okay? It's pretty early. She's gone, son. Your mother died an hour ago. Silence. Then, I'll handle the arrangements from here. I know people. People. Not, I'll come home. Not, I need to be there. People who could handle arrangements while he continued his life uninterrupted. The scraping of folding chairs brought me back to the present. People were standing, gathering coats, preparing to move toward the graveside. Margaret's casket waited, surrounded by those white lilies that reminded me of her garden, her hope, her unwavering faith in a son who'd abandoned her when she needed him most. I rose with the others, mechanically accepting condolences from relatives who had no idea their beloved nephew had chosen vacation over their farewell. The scraping of folding chairs brought me fully back to the present as people gathered coats and moved toward the graveside. Family members approached with gentle touches, hushed condolences, and expectant glances toward the parking area where they still hoped to see Timothy arrive, fashionably late but appropriately apologetic. Margaret would be so proud of this turnout, Cousin Robert said, gripping my shoulder. She touched so many lives. Thank you for being here, I replied automatically, the words feeling rehearsed after dozens of repetitions. Mamie appeared beside me, clutching her purse and looking around uncertainly. Shouldn't we wait for Timothy? He must be stuck in terrible traffic. Before I could formulate another careful lie, a familiar voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Otis. Thurman Hayes stood 3 feet away, his weathered hands folded in front of him. He'd driven an hour from the south side, wearing his good navy jacket and the same serious expression he'd worn at job sites when something needed fixing. We'd worked construction together for 15 years before I moved into engineering, shared coffee breaks and complaints about supervisors who'd never swung a hammer. Thurman! I shook his offered hand, surprised by the strength of his grip, the way he held on a moment longer than necessary. I've known you 40 years, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd behind me. Where's Timothy? I didn't see him during the service. The direct question caught me off guard. While others had asked with gentle concern, Thurman's tone carried the bluntness of old friendship, the right to expect honest answers. He couldn't make it. The words felt heavier this time. He's in Florida. Thurman's eyebrows rose slightly. Florida? Today? For what? I glanced around, ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. Other mourners were making their way toward the burial site, voices subdued, movements respectful. Vacation. Said the funeral wasn't worth his time. The silence stretched between us. Thurman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Disappointment mixed with recognition, as if he'd suspected something like this but hoped to be wrong. Margaret would be heartbroken, he said finally. She never got to say goodbye to him. The admission escaped before I could stop it, carrying 2 years of suppressed frustration. 2 years of treatments, Thurman. 2 years of asking for him, making excuses for him, believing he'd come when it mattered. Thurman nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Margaret's casket being prepared for transport. "I watched you support that boy for decades. When does it end?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, some lessons can only be learned the hard way." His voice carried the weight of experience, decades of watching friends navigate family crises, career setbacks, personal failures. Margaret protected him from consequences his whole life, made excuses when he disappointed people, covered for him when he hurt feelings. I thought about Timothy's childhood, Margaret rushing to school when he forgot assignments, calling his boss when he overslept, smoothing over conflicts with friends who felt neglected. She'd called it supporting his potential. Looking back, it seemed more like enabling his selfishness. She wanted me to understand him, I said, to forgive him. Understanding someone doesn't mean accepting everything they do. Thurman shifted his weight, the movement deliberate and measured. I had a brother who gambled away his family's savings. My mother kept bailing him out, saying love meant never giving up. Know what happened? I shook my head. He never learned, kept gambling because consequences never stuck. Sometimes the most loving things, letting someone face the results of their choices. Around us, the crowd was thinning as people moved toward their cars or walked to the burial site. Cemetery workers began folding chairs, their movements efficient and practiced. The ceremony's formal structure was dissolving into the messier reality of grief, logistics, and family obligations. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. Thurman was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "Margaret left him something in the will, didn't she? The house is mine, but there's money, her teacher's pension, some investments. She wanted Timothy to be comfortable. Even after he abandoned her?" The question hung in the air between us. Margaret had revised her will during the final weeks, ensuring Timothy would inherit enough to maintain his lifestyle. She'd called it faith in his future. I'd seen it as one last attempt to buy the love he'd never freely given. She believed he'd change, I said. Thought responsibility might mature him. "And you? What do you believe?" I watched the funeral director supervising the casket's movement, his staff working with quiet professionalism around Margaret's final journey. In a few minutes, she'd be lowered into ground that had been waiting for her since I'd purchased the plots 20 years ago, back when death seemed distant and Timothy still called every Sunday. "I believe some people don't change until they have to," I admitted. Thurman nodded. "Don't let this pass, Otis. Don't let him think his mother's death doesn't matter. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way." He clasped my shoulder once, firmly, then walked toward his pickup truck without looking back. I stood alone among the scattered funeral programs and wilting flower petals, his words echoing, "Don't let this pass." The graveside service would begin soon, Margaret's final send-off, attended by everyone who'd loved her, except the one person whose presence she'd wanted most. I walked slowly toward my car, key in hand but making no move to start the engine. Through the windshield I could see Mamie still scanning the parking area, hopefully, probably wondering if Timothy's delayed flight had finally landed. Other relatives clustered near their vehicles, waiting for direction about what came next. What came next? That seemed to be the question Margaret had left me with, along with a house full of memories and a son who'd blocked my number to protect his vacation from family interruption. I sat in the driver's seat, key in the ignition but not turning it, contemplating Thurman's words about lessons and consequences. Somewhere in Florida, Timothy was probably posting another beach photo while his mother's body waited for burial, living his best life while avoiding any reminder of the life that had given him everything. Margaret's voice whispered in my memory, "Promise me you'll understand him." But understanding someone, as Thurman had said, didn't mean accepting everything they did. The 30-minute drive home felt like hours. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before finally turning off the engine, staring at the house Margaret and I had shared for 28 years. The afternoon sun cast familiar shadows across the front porch, but everything felt different now, emptier, like a movie set after the actors had gone home. I walked to the front door, fumbling with keys that suddenly felt foreign in my hands. The house greeted me with silence so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing against my eardrums until I had to clear my throat just to hear something. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter beside her crossword puzzle book. Her coffee mug waited in the dish drainer, clean and ready for a morning that would never come. I touched the rim gently, remembering how she'd always drunk her coffee too hot, blowing across the surface while complaining about my patience. Loosening my black tie, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and methodically removed the funeral suit. Each piece felt like armor I was finally allowed to discard. The jacket that had contained my rage, the shirt that had absorbed my tears, the pants that had carried me through the longest day of my life. I pulled on comfortable jeans and Margaret's favorite sweater of mine, the blue wool one she'd given me 3 Christmases ago. It still smelled faintly of her perfume from the last time she'd hugged me while I was wearing it. Downstairs, I made coffee without thinking, muscle memory guiding my hands through the familiar routine. 2 scoops, not 3. Margaret had always preferred it weaker than I did. Only when the pot finished brewing did I realize I'd automatically pulled down 2 mugs from the cabinet, hers and mine, side by side like they'd been every morning for decades. The sight of that second mug, waiting for someone who would never need coffee again, nearly broke me. I put hers back and filled mine, then wandered into the living room where framed photographs covered every surface. Our wedding day, Margaret radiant in white lace, me terrified but trying to look confident. Timothy's high school graduation, all 3 of us beaming with pride and possibility. College orientation with Timothy looking sophisticated and independent, while Margaret tried not to cry. More recent photos told a different story. Timothy's marketing awards ceremonies, where we'd driven 8 hours to watch him accept recognition from colleagues who knew him better than we did. His apartment warming in New York, where he'd seemed embarrassed by our presence among his professional friends. Last Christmas, the final time he'd visited, his smile strained and his attention constantly drifting to his phone. 40 years I raised that boy, I said aloud to Margaret's favorite armchair. 40 years of Little League games where you cheered louder than any mother in the stands. School plays where you brought flowers even when he forgot his lines. The chair didn't answer, but I could hear her voice anyway. He's just building his career, Otis. Young people need to focus on their futures. But when does building a future stop being an excuse for abandoning the past? I asked the empty room. When does ambition become selfishness? I sank into Margaret's chair, something I'd rarely done while she was alive. It still held the impression of her small frame, still smelled like the lavender lotion she'd used every night before bed. From here, she'd watched her garden bloom through the seasons, read countless books, graded papers from students who'd adored her. Thurman's words echoed in my mind. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Margaret had protected Timothy from consequences his entire life. Forgotten homework became her emergency runs to school. Missed deadlines became her phone calls to understanding teachers. Failed responsibilities became our financial safety nets, our emotional cushions, our endless supply of second chances. Even during her illness, she'd made excuses for his absence. He's just scared, she'd whispered after another missed visit. Death frightens young people. As if fear justified abandonment. As if being scared gave him permission to let his mother die alone, except for an increasingly exhausted husband. I picked up the photo from Timothy's college graduation, studying his face for signs of the man he'd become. At 18, he'd still hugged us both without embarrassment, still called every Sunday to share stories about classes and friends and dreams we'd helped him chase. When had that changed? When had our son become someone who could choose a Florida beach over his mother's funeral? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Looking back, I could trace the gradual cooling, phone calls growing shorter, visits becoming obligations, our lives becoming inconveniences he managed, rather than relationships he cherished. Margaret had noticed too, though she'd never admitted it. I'd catch her waiting by the phone on Sundays, hoping for calls that came later and later until they stopped altogether. She'd mentioned Timothy's name with careful optimism, testing whether today might be the day he remembered he had parents who loved him. "You always saw the best in him, sweetheart," I said to her photograph, even when he stopped seeing us at all. The afternoon light was fading, casting longer shadows across the living room. I should eat something, I knew. Should call Mamie to let her know I'd gotten home safely. should begin the process of thanking people for their flowers and condolences. Instead, I sat in Margaret's chair, holding our son's graduation photo, finally allowing myself to acknowledge what she'd never been willing to admit. Timothy had left us long before today. Today, he'd simply made it official. Thurman was right. Some lessons could only be learned the hard way. The question was whether I had the courage to teach them. I opened the laptop and waited for it to boot up, my decision crystallizing with each passing second. The familiar desktop appeared, a photo of Margaret in her garden, taken last spring when she'd still been strong enough to plant the roses she'd never see bloom. Banking websites required passwords, security questions, verification codes. I'd set up all our financial accounts years ago, back when Margaret had trusted me to handle such things, while she focused on teaching and family. Now that trust would serve a different purpose. The bank's blue and white interface loaded with practiced efficiency. Checking account, savings account, mortgage payments, utility bills, all the mundane architecture of a life built together over decades. I navigated to the recurring payments section with engineer's precision, knowing exactly what I'd find. There it was. Recurring payment, $3,200 monthly to Timothy Cole mortgage account. Next scheduled payment, April 30th, 2025. Total payments sent, 96 transfers. 96 transfers. 8 years of monthly payments, each one representing Margaret's faith that our son would eventually appreciate the sacrifice. Each one proving that love, when not reciprocated, becomes enabling. I clicked the payment history link and watched years of transactions scroll across the screen. March 2025, $3,200. February 2025, $3,200. January 2025, $3,200. Sent while Margaret lay dying and Timothy couldn't be bothered to visit. My calculator app confirmed what my engineer's mind had already computed. $3,200 times 12 months times 8 years equals $307,200. $300,000. Margaret and I could have taken that European trip she'd always dreamed about. Could have renovated the kitchen she'd complained about for 15 years. Could have helped a dozen students pay for college instead of subsidizing one ungrateful child's lifestyle. I scrolled further back, finding Timothy's original email from 2017. Dad, I know this is a big ask, but the New York market is crazy expensive. If you could help with the mortgage payments until I get established, I promise I'll pay you back once my career takes off. 8 years later, his career had taken off spectacularly. His social media posts showcased expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, designer clothes, but somehow he'd never gotten around to paying us back, never even mentioned the possibility. Well, Timothy, I said to the laptop screen, you said the funeral wasn't worth your time. Let's see if your mortgage is worth mine. I clicked Manage Recurring Payment and read the cancellation terms. Immediate effect. No waiting period. No grace period. No notification to the recipient beyond their bank's standard procedures. The confirmation screen appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring payment? Below that, in smaller text, this action cannot be undone. Future payments will not be automatically sent. I thought about Margaret's voice. Promise me you'll take care of Timothy. I had taken care of him. For 35 years I had taken care of him, fed him, clothed him, educated him, supported his dreams, funded his lifestyle, enabled his selfishness. I'd taken such good care of him that he'd never learned to take care of himself or anyone else. Maybe it was time for Timothy to learn what taking care of himself actually meant. I clicked Yes, Cancel Payment. The confirmation appeared instantly. Recurring payment canceled. Effective immediately. Confirmation email sent to account holder. My inbox pinged within seconds. Payment cancellation confirmed. Timothy Cole mortgage account will no longer receive automatic transfers from your checking account. 8 years of financial support ended with 2 mouse clicks. I leaned back in the kitchen chair, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Lightness. Not the emptiness of grief, but the relief of a burden finally lifted. For the first time since Margaret's diagnosis, I wasn't responsible for someone else's obligations. Timothy would receive his bank's notification within 24 hours. His next mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks. He'd have just enough time to panic, to realize that Daddy wasn't going to handle this particular problem for him. He'd probably call once he discovered his safety net had disappeared, but his number was still blocked in my phone, and I had no intention of changing that. Some conversations required earning, and Timothy had significant earning to do. The laptop screen dimmed automatically, asking if I wanted to continue my session. I closed the banking website and shut the computer, pushing it aside with the satisfaction of a job completed. $300,000. Margaret would understand, eventually. She'd wanted me to take care of Timothy, but she'd also taught her students that actions had consequences, that responsibility couldn't be learned without practice. Tonight, Timothy was practicing being responsible for his own mortgage. Tomorrow, we'd see how well he'd been paying attention. I walked to the refrigerator with lighter steps than I'd taken in months, opening it to discover possibilities instead of obligations. Margaret had always planned our meals, worried about nutrition, made sure I ate properly even when grief killed my appetite. Tonight, for the first time since her death, I felt genuinely hungry. Eggs, butter, good bread, simple ingredients for a simple meal. I cracked 3 eggs into a bowl and watched them blend into golden smoothness, remembering Margaret's teasing about my legendary scrambled eggs. "Only man I know who makes them fluffy as clouds," she'd said. Tonight, they were fluffy as clouds. I set the kitchen table with our good dishes, the wedding china we'd saved for special occasions that came too rarely. If eating my first peaceful meal in months wasn't special, nothing was. The plates looked elegant under the warm kitchen lights, reflecting a satisfaction I'd forgotten was possible. "First time in months I actually taste my food," I said aloud, savoring each bite. The eggs were perfect, the toast crisp, the butter real instead of the diet substitute Margaret had insisted on. Simple pleasures, returned to me along with the freedom to enjoy them. After dinner I moved to the living room and settled into Margaret's favorite armchair with the remote control. She'd always chosen our evening entertainment, gravitating toward classic films that reminded her of her childhood. Tonight I selected one of her favorites, a Cary Grant romantic comedy that had made her laugh even during the worst days of her illness. "Remember this movie, sweetheart?" I asked her photograph on the side table. "You always said Cary Grant could charm his way out of anything. Maybe you'd approve of a little charm working against Timothy for once." The familiar dialogue washed over me, bringing comfort instead of sadness. Margaret's presence felt lighter tonight, less like an absence and more like a blessing, as if she understood that love sometimes required difficult choices, that protecting someone from consequences wasn't the same as protecting them from harm. My phone sat on the end table, deliberately powered off. For months I'd kept it close, anxious about calls that might bring emergency news, updates about Margaret's condition, or brief conversations with Timothy that left me feeling more alone than silence. Tonight I wanted genuine quiet. No interruptions, no obligations, no disappointments. "Strange how much lighter the house feels tonight," I murmured, surprised by the truth of it. Margaret's death had filled every room with her absence, but Timothy's rejection had somehow cleared the air. No more waiting for calls that wouldn't come. No more making excuses for behavior that couldn't be excused. The movie ended near 10 o'clock, earlier than I'd usually retire, but later than I'd managed since the funeral arrangements began. I turned off the television and made my way upstairs, moving through the bedtime routine that had felt impossible for weeks. Brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The kind of calm that comes after making a difficult decision and knowing it was right. In the bedroom, I undressed slowly, hanging my clothes with the care Margaret had always insisted on. "Clothes last longer when you treat them properly," she'd said, and tonight the familiar routine felt like honoring her practical wisdom rather than mourning her absence. I slipped between clean sheets. I'd changed them yesterday in preparation for guests who might visit after the funeral, and lay quietly in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. No racing thoughts about Timothy's next crisis. No anxiety about phone calls I couldn't answer, just quiet anticipation. "Wonder how long it'll take him to notice," I said to the ceiling, genuine curiosity replacing months of worry. Rolling over to Margaret's side of the bed, I spoke to her pillow. "Sleep well, love. Justice is coming. For the first time since her death, I closed my eyes with a genuine smile. Sleep came easily, dreamless and deep, the rest of a man who'd finally stopped carrying burdens that weren't his to bear. Outside, Chicago settled into its nighttime rhythm, but inside our house, peace had returned. Tomorrow would bring Timothy's discovery, his panic, his desperate attempts to restore the financial safety net he'd taken for granted. But tonight belonged to me, to rest, to satisfaction, to the quiet pleasure of consequences, finally catching up with choices. Margaret would have understood. She'd spent 40 years teaching children that actions mattered, that responsibility was learned through practice, that love sometimes meant allowing people to face the results of their decisions. Timothy's education was about to begin. The past week had been the most peaceful I'd known in years. I'd spent mornings tending Margaret's garden, afternoons organizing her belongings with care rather than grief, evenings reading books I'd set aside during her illness. For the first time since her diagnosis, I'd slept through entire nights without waking to check on someone who no longer needed checking. Then Timothy's name appeared on my phone screen. I stared at the display for 3 rings, considering whether to answer. Part of me was curious about what crisis had finally forced him to unblock my number. Another part wanted to let it ring, to give him a taste of the silence he'd imposed on me. But mostly I felt nothing. No anxiety, no anger, just mild interest in seeing how long it would take him to acknowledge reality. On the 4th ring, I picked up. "Dad? Hey!" His voice carried that casual tone I remembered from childhood, when he'd call to ask for rides or money, assuming both would be provided without question. "Sorry I blocked you last week. I just needed some space after, you know." "I understand," I said, settling back into Margaret's chair with my afternoon coffee. "Good, good. Listen, I'm back from Florida now, and there's this weird issue with my mortgage. The bank says my April payment wasn't made. Your automatic transfer must have glitched or something." The assumption in his voice was breathtaking. No mention of the funeral he'd missed, no acknowledgement of his mother's burial, no apology for dismissing 37 years of love as not worth his time. Just an expectation that I'd fix his financial problem while he moved on to more important matters. "It wasn't a glitch?" I said. A pause. I could hear papers rustling in the background, probably bank statements or mortgage documents he'd never bothered to read before. "What do you mean? Can you just call them and fix it?" "No. That's your responsibility now, Timothy." The silence stretched longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from casual to concerned. "My responsibility? Dad, you've always handled this. What's going on?" "What's going on is exactly what you told me last week." "What are you talking about?" The rustling sounds increased, as if he were frantically searching through paperwork for answers he'd never needed before. "You said your mother's funeral wasn't worth your time." I kept my voice level, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "Well, your mortgage isn't worth mine." The explosive silence that followed felt like vindication. I could picture him in his expensive Manhattan apartment, surrounded by the lifestyle my money had helped maintain, finally beginning to understand that actions had consequences. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice climbing toward panic. "This is about Mom's funeral? Dad, that was emotional. This is real money we're talking about. Your mother was real, Timothy. Her love for you was real. Her hope that you'd visit during her final weeks was real. I was building my career. I couldn't just drop everything every time she had a bad day." Every time she had a bad day. 2 years of cancer treatments, of watching her shrink and weaken and fade, reduced to occasional inconveniences in his busy schedule. "She died waiting for you to call," I said. "Do you know that? Her last week, she kept asking if you'd phoned. I kept making excuses because I couldn't bear to tell her the truth, that her son was too important to spare 5 minutes for his dying mother." "That's not fair. I sent flowers. I called when I could." "You called twice in 6 months, both times to ask about her prognosis, never to speak with her directly." The papers stopped rustling. In the silence, I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow. The reality was finally penetrating the bubble of self-interest he'd lived in for years. "Look, I made mistakes, okay? But you can't punish me by destroying my financial stability. I'm not punishing you. I'm simply no longer enabling you. Enabling? Dad, you promised you'd help with my mortgage. A promise is a promise. The audacity was stunning. Timothy, who'd broken every promise to his dying mother, lecturing me about keeping commitments. And you promised to be there for your family, I replied. You promised to visit your mother. You promised to call more often. Promises work both ways, son. This is different. This was emotional stuff. This is money. This is real. There it was, the core of who Timothy had become. Emotions were optional. Relationships were conveniences. But money was sacred. Margaret's final months had been emotional stuff, while his mortgage was the only reality that mattered. I walked to the window and looked out at Margaret's garden, where spring flowers were beginning to bloom despite her absence. She'd always believed in Timothy's potential, always made excuses for his failures, always hoped he'd grow into the man she'd raised him to be. She'd been wrong. "Goodbye, Timothy," I said. "Dad, wait. You can't just—" I hung up and immediately blocked his number, watching the confirmation appear on my screen. Contact blocked. The same message he'd shown me a week ago when his vacation was more important than his mother's funeral. The house felt quieter after that, but it was a good quiet, the peace of decisions made and consequences accepted. Outside, Margaret's roses were blooming exactly as she'd planted them, beautiful and strong and requiring no help from anyone who didn't truly care for them. Timothy's name appeared on my phone screen again within minutes. He'd called from a different number, probably his work line, thinking he could circumvent my blocking. I answered on the first ring this time, curious to see how far his desperation would drive him. "Don't you dare hang up on me!" His voice shot up an octave, revealing the son I remembered from childhood tantrums when he couldn't get his way, demanding, entitled, unable to accept that the world might not revolve around his needs. "I wasn't planning to," I said, settling into Margaret's chair again. This conversation deserved my full attention. "You can't just stop paying my mortgage. Do you understand what you're doing to me?" "I understand exactly what I'm doing. What I don't understand is why you think you're entitled to $3,000 of my money every month." "Because you promised. When I moved to New York, you said you'd help until I got established." "That was 8 years ago, Timothy. Your salary is 6 figures now. Your bonus last year could have paid your mortgage for 2 years. When exactly were you planning to get established?" The question hung in the air. I could hear him breathing hard, probably pacing around his apartment, searching for arguments that would restore his financial safety net. "It's not about the money," he said finally. "It's about family. Family helps each other." The irony was breathtaking. Timothy, who'd abandoned his family when help was needed most, lecturing me about mutual support. "You're absolutely right," I said. "Family does help each other. When Margaret was dying, your family needed you. Where were you?" "I was working, building a future. You know how competitive my industry is. And when she died, your family needed you at her funeral. Where were you?" "I needed time to process. I couldn't just drop everything and fly to Chicago." "You were already in Florida, on vacation, posting videos of yourself on the beach while your mother was being buried." Another silence, shorter this time, but heavier, the weight of truth settling into places where excuses used to live. "Fine," he exploded. "I made mistakes. I wasn't perfect, but you can't destroy my life over it." "I'm not destroying anything. I'm just no longer building it for you." "This is insane. You're supposed to be my father." "And she was supposed to be able to count on her son. Margaret defended you for 35 years, Timothy. Made excuses when you disappointed friends. Covered for you when you broke promises. Sent you money when you claimed to need help. She died believing you loved her." "I did love her?" "Then why didn't you show up when love required action instead of words?" "Because," his voice cracked slightly, "because I couldn't handle seeing her like that. Sick and weak and dying. You couldn't handle seeing your mother die, so you left me to handle it alone. You're stronger than me. You always were. I knew you could take care of her." There it was, the final revelation. Timothy hadn't abandoned us because he was busy or ambitious or scared. He'd abandoned us because it was easier to let someone else carry the burden while he lived his comfortable life. "Margaret weighed 90 pounds when she died," I said quietly. 90 pounds from a woman who used to garden for hours, who taught 30 children every day, who made you lunch every morning before school for 12 years. She spent her final weeks asking about you, hoping you'd call, believing you still cared enough to say goodbye. Stop it. She made me promise to understand you, to forgive you, to keep taking care of you even after she was gone. Then do it. Honor her wishes. I am honoring her wishes. I'm teaching you what she never could, that love requires responsibility, that family means showing up, that some promises can't be broken without consequences. Dad, please. I'll lose my apartment. I'll lose everything. And I lost my wife, my partner of 37 years, the woman who made excuses for you until her dying breath, but somehow your mortgage is more important than her memory. It's not the same thing. You're right, it's not. Margaret's death was permanent. Your financial inconvenience is temporary. You have a good job, excellent credit, and 8 years of mortgage payments I made for you. You'll figure something out. What if I don't? What if I can't? Then you'll learn what I learned during Margaret's illness, that some battles you fight alone, some burdens you carry yourself, and some responsibilities can't be delegated to other people. I'm your son. You can't abandon me. The accusation hit like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because of its stunning hypocrisy. Timothy, who'd abandoned his dying mother, claiming abandonment because his father wouldn't pay his bills. And she was your mother, I said, but that didn't stop you from abandoning her when she needed you most. Fine, I was a terrible son. Is that what you want to hear? I was selfish and weak, and I let her down. But destroying my life won't bring her back. I'm not destroying your life, Timothy. I'm giving you the chance to build one yourself, without my money propping it up. Margaret always believed you had potential. Maybe it's time you found out if she was right. This is about revenge, isn't it? You want me to suffer because I missed the funeral. This is about justice. You chose your vacation over your mother's funeral. Now you get to choose your own solution to your mortgage problem. Same principle. Your choices, your consequences. Dad, wait! Goodbye, Timothy. I ended the call and immediately blocked this number too, watching my phone display the same contact blocked message. 2 numbers down, however many he had left to go. But each blocked number represented a choice. His choice to prioritize convenience over relationship, money over memory, himself over everyone else. The house settled into silence again, but this time it felt final. No more calls, no more crises, no more enabling disguised as love. Timothy would have to learn responsibility the way Margaret had always wanted him to, through practice, consequences, and the discovery that other people's generosity wasn't unlimited. I looked at her photograph on the side table, imagining her reaction to what I'd just done. She might have been shocked initially, but Margaret was a teacher. She understood that some lessons could only be learned through experience, that protecting someone from consequences wasn't the same as protecting them from harm. I think you'd approve, I said to her image. Tough love was always your specialty, even when you couldn't apply it to him. Outside, evening was settling over the neighborhood. Normal people were coming home from normal jobs to normal families, who showed up for each other when it mattered. Tomorrow, I'd wake up without worrying about Timothy's next crisis, next demand, next assumption that his problems were mine to solve. For the first time in 8 years, my money would stay in my account where it belonged. 3 weeks passed without a single call from Timothy. 3 weeks of the most peaceful mornings I'd had in years, where coffee tasted like pleasure instead of obligation, where newspapers brought information instead of anxiety about which story might trigger my son's next financial crisis. I'd used the time well. Margaret's garden required attention she could no longer provide, and I discovered unexpected satisfaction in continuing work her hands had started. The roses she'd planted were blooming spectacularly, as if her absence had freed them to flourish without constraint. The travel agency on Lincoln Avenue had been helpful when I'd explained what I wanted. A Mediterranean cruise departing in June, the Greek islands Margaret had dreamed about visiting since we'd watched that travel documentary 5 years ago. She'd marked pages in travel magazines, researched restaurants in Santorini, planned excursions to ancient ruins she'd studied as a young teacher. This would be perfect for someone starting fresh, the travel agent had said, spreading brochures across her desk like possibilities made tangible. My wife always wanted to see the Greek islands, I'd replied. I think she'd approve of me finally taking that trip. It's never too late to honor someone's dreams. No, it wasn't. And with $3,000 staying in my account every month instead of subsidizing Timothy's lifestyle, honoring Margaret's dreams had become financially possible. 8 years of mortgage payments translated to years of travel, experiences, adventures she'd postponed, while we supported our ungrateful son. The bank manager had been impressed when I'd opened the new savings account. European Cruise Fund, I'd labeled it, watching the balance grow with money that had previously disappeared into Timothy's Manhattan apartment. Numbers on a screen that represented freedom instead of enablement. My phone had stayed blissfully quiet. No desperate calls about mortgage payments, no panicked voicemails about eviction notices, no demands for emergency financial rescues. Whatever Timothy was doing to solve his housing crisis, he was doing it without my involvement, exactly as it should be. Thurman had called twice, checking on my welfare with the concern of 4 decades of friendship. I'd told him about the cruise, about the garden, about the profound peace that had settled over my life since I'd stopped being Timothy's financial safety net. Margaret would be proud, he'd said. Took you long enough to learn what she always knew. What's that? That sometimes loving someone means letting them learn the hard way. The cemetery visit had become a weekly ritual, bringing fresh flowers from Margaret's garden to place beside her headstone. Today I'd brought news along with the roses. Well, sweetheart, I said, arranging the blooms carefully against the marble. I booked that cruise you always wanted, leaving for Athens in 6 weeks, then sailing to all those islands you circled in the travel guides. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, as if she approved. Timothy called a few times after he lost his mortgage payment, seemed surprised that actions have consequences. Imagine that. I settled into the familiar rhythm of one-sided conversation that had developed since her death. You always said I was too soft on him. Turns out you were right. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery grounds, peaceful and eternal. Other visitors moved quietly among the headstones, bringing their own flowers, sharing their own news with loved ones who could no longer respond, but somehow still listened. $300,000, I continued. That's what we spent on his mortgage over 8 years. Enough for that kitchen renovation you wanted, that European trip you postponed. Maybe help a few deserving students pay for college, instead of enabling one ungrateful child. Margaret's photograph smiled from its weatherproof frame, the same expression she'd worn when discussing difficult students who'd finally grasped challenging concepts. Patient, understanding, but firm in her belief that learning required effort. Growth demanded struggle, and love sometimes meant saying no. I think you understand why I did it, I said. You spent 40 years teaching children that choices have consequences, that responsibility can't be delegated, that growing up means handling your own problems. Maybe it's time Timothy learned what you always tried to teach him. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where I'd lived my entire adult life, past schools where Margaret had taught, through communities where we'd built friendships that would outlast my son's resentment. Chicago in late spring was beautiful, trees budding, families emerging from winter hibernation, life continuing its ancient cycle of renewal and growth. At home, I made dinner with ingredients I'd chosen for pleasure rather than economy, eating slowly while planning tomorrow's garden work. The house felt lighter without the weight of Timothy's endless needs, more spacious without his problems crowding every corner. My new passport had arrived yesterday, crisp and official, ready for adventures Margaret and I had planned, but never taken. The cruise itinerary sat on the kitchen counter beside travel guides to Greek islands, Roman ruins, Mediterranean ports where ancient civilizations had flourished and faded, leaving lessons about the importance of building something lasting. Timothy would learn to build his own life now, without my money, as foundation. Whether he succeeded or failed would depend on qualities Margaret had tried to instill, but I'd undermined through enabling. Resilience, responsibility, the understanding that love meant earning as well as receiving. The evening news played softly in the background, stories of distant conflicts and local triumphs, reminders that the world continued spinning, regardless of individual struggles. Somewhere in New York, Timothy was probably apartment hunting, learning what $3,000 really meant when it came from his own paycheck instead of his father's generosity. I felt no guilt about his situation, no urge to rescue him from consequences he'd created. Margaret had died, hoping he'd grow into the man she'd always believed he could become. My enabling had prevented that growth for years, but no longer. Outside, spring was turning towards summer, Margaret's garden blooming with colors she'd chosen, fragrances she'd loved, beauty she'd cultivated with her own hands. In 6 weeks, I'd board a ship bound for places she'd dreamed of seeing, carrying her memory to islands where ancient wisdom still whispered about the eternal, human struggle between love and accountability. The phone remained silent, and the silence was perfect. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.